The Broken Earth Trilogy was a winner of the 2016, 2017, and 2018 Hugo Awards for science fiction. It's set in a dystopia future where there's frequent seismic quakes that lead to major climate catastrophes every generation. N.K. Jemisin said that she likes to write a story that centers around someone that looks like her as the protagonist. Large, black, middle-aged, and female. This was the funnest read for me. I devoured, there was 3 large books in approximately a week, and I carried them with me everywhere. It reminded me of when I was 13 years old and first starting to read and collect my own books, and I read a lot of science fiction stuff by Isaac Asimov, C.S. Lewis, Orson Scott Card, and more. These books, however, never contained characters that I could personally relate to, so it was really refreshing to read a sci-fi action where the main ensemble were primarily women, queer or trans, and people of color, and that those identities were just seamlessly part of the narrative. The trilogy had me reflecting on themes of pain and resilience, generational trauma, and survival. Journey to the East by Hermann Hesse carries the same search for enlightenment themes that made Hesse's novel Siddhartha famous in the West. In Journey, a man reminisces about a mysterious league to which he belonged in his youth. This league was a society of magic and art and music, and serves as, I believe, a metaphor for spirituality and mysticism. The narrator loses contact with the League and longs to return to it. One day he unwittingly bumps into the Grand Master of the League, and through the setting of a trial, he discovers that the League had never left him. Rather, he lost the eyes with which to see the League all around him. This short novel celebrates the mystical beauty that we find in art. I felt challenged by it to reclaim my own love for literature and to accept that we are all characters of our own stories, characters that will outlive our bodies through the memories of others. This book was so impactful for me that I believe it should be mandatory reading for every person of faith. If we were still adding books to the biblical canon, I would lobby for this one. It's a fictionalized account of Wiesel's experience in the Auschwitz and Buchenwald concentration camps. It feels like reading the Book of Lamentations, in that it expresses the fervent faith of a people who cry out to a silent God. Like Lamentations, there is a brief moment of faith in the middle, but that's it. There's no moralizing, no answers. God doesn't miraculously save them. And it does not end with the return of faith. In Lamentations, the silence of God is intentional. For if God spoke, God's voice would be so loud that we wouldn't hear the voices of God's people. I think Wiesel is doing a similar thing. We need to hear the pain of the Holocaust without rushing to defend or apologize for God. This book is terrible. Terrible. I held on to it to make sure that it didn't fall into other hands. I would destroy it, but I'm kind of holding on to it as a reference of horrible theology. Everything about it is wrong, but the worst is his surprisingly large chapter in this tiny book, Defending the Devil. Lucado misattributes biblical quotes as referring to Satan, and then explains how God uses Satan as a tool to refine us, awaken us, and teach us. Lucado doesn't explain how God could use the tool of evil without being evil. If Satan is just following God's instructions, then what's the difference between God and Satan? It's like saying the gun is evil, but the mass shooter isn't. I'd accuse this book of heresy, but I believe its real guilt is lazy writing. If you come across it, shred it. Set in apartheid South Africa, a Zulu pastor, Kumalo, travels to Johannesburg in search for his son. Like the book of Job, this story documents the suffering and loss experienced by a good person of faith. Despite his great faithfulness and devotion, God does not spare this pastor the pain of life. We see Pastor Camillo devastated and made a shell of himself, desperately clinging to what little faith remains. Then, like Job, blessings return to Camillo's life, and his faith is reborn. There's no attempt here to address the question of theodicy. Rather, it simply depicts the cycle of faith that we seasonally encounter. This is summed up in the words of a secondary character who says, "I have never thought that a Christian would be free of suffering, Unfundisi. For our Lord suffered, and I come to believe that he suffered not to save us from suffering, but to teach us how to bear suffering. For he knew there is no life without suffering." The main character in The Woman of the Pharisees is named Bridget. And if you're a fan of Schitt's Creek, you've already met this character. She's a deeply religious version of Moira Rose. She's very concerned with piety and appearance, a self-righteous busybody who's preoccupied with ensuring everyone else's salvation. In her striving for perfection, she inadvertently ruins the lives of everyone around her, including the local priest. Towards the end of the novel, the priest reflects on his encounter with Bridget, writing, "My mistake and hers are at bottom identical. Both of us have been inclined to believe that it is our duty to interfere in the destinies of those around us. I do not deny that it is the first duty of the sacred office conferred by priesthood to preach the gospel, but that does not mean that we should try to turn our neighbor into a replica of ourselves or force him to see with our eyes." I felt little sympathy or attraction to Mauriac's aristocratic characters. Although Mauriac is a Nobel Prize winner, this particular book felt trapped in its pre-war French setting, with concerns and attitudes that don't translate well to a global audience. Many of us in the church are just as self-righteous as Bridget, but the character is too dated for us to feel convicted by her story. I want to support stories that center women, but in this case, I wish Mauriac had written the main character as a man more like himself. With a bit more honesty and vulnerability, I think this could have been a timeless novel. I love Bryan Stevenson. This man is amazing. Just Mercy is the true story of his work as a lawyer defending inmates on death row in Alabama. If you've seen the movie starring Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx, you'll know that the case where Stevenson successfully defended Walter McMillan, who was sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. But Stevenson's work is a lot bigger than that one case. In his book, he documents several cases he worked on, each as upsetting and unjust as that McMillan case. It demonstrates how racially biased the justice system is and how brutal the penal system is. Stevenson and his team fought for people who had no other hope and fought against insurmountable odds. I don't know if he'd accept it, but I would nominate Stevenson for sainthood if I could. It is clear throughout the book that religious faith is a pillar in Stevenson's life. Near the end of the book, after the reader is feeling worn out by these stories of oppression, Stevenson speaks about being broken himself by the years of struggling against inequality, abuse of power, and poverty. He talks about the story in the Bible where the woman is caught in adultery and Jesus invites her accusers to throw the first stone. Stevenson writes, "But today, our self-righteousness, our fear, and our anger have caused even the Christians to hurl stones at people who fall down. Even when we know we should forgive or show compassion, we can't simply watch that happen. We have to be stone catchers." One day while in the courthouse, an older black woman has a private moment with Stevenson. She takes his hand and calls him a stone catcher. She massages his palm, saying, "Well, it hurts to catch all them stones people throw." Stevenson almost cries. For Stevenson, this was a moment of being seen and encouraged, and As a reader, I too felt like this woman was massaging my poem. When we do the work of bringing about justice and equality, when we stand up to oppression, we get hurt. It will break you. But there is a strength in that brokenness. There's a solidarity with those who know the struggle. There is hope. I was getting discouraged with Canada's reads on CBC. It's a book competition. For the past 5 years, I've tried to read the Indigenous Book of the Year. They're often set in the prairies, sometimes with connections to 118th Ave in Edmonton. And I love them. I root for them. And then they get kicked off. I started to give up on Canada Reads. So you can imagine my excitement when I heard that a queer two-spirit Indigenous novel won this year's selection. The first thing I do in the Edmonton airport, even before I pick up my bags, is to buy Jonny Appleseed. The story follows a young two-spirit sex worker in Winnipeg as he plans to trip back to his reserve. The novel is graphic. It's graphic about sex. It's graphic about trauma. It's not a book for everyone. What I liked about it is how visual and tangible it reads. In my ministry, I've known people like Jonny. It felt very real. At the same time, that was my problem with it. Jonny is a fictional character. It's not a memoir. The author makes choices about Jonny and his community that trouble me a bit. I'm hesitant to criticize it, but all I'll say is if you only read one book by a Canadian Indigenous author, I don't think it should be this one. Maybe this should be the second one you read. Like the other books I've read during my intermission, this too had lots of spirituality woven through it. In this case, in a more literal way. Jonny has visions and dreams reflecting on life, death, and the afterlife. What his book excels most at is seeing beauty in brokenness and pain. I started reading this book in week 10 of my intermission, but I'm nowhere close to finishing it. Considering Proust's In Search of Lost Time series did win the Guinness record for longest novel, it might take me a lifetime to finish this book. I think the book is lovely. I've enjoyed it, but it is excruciatingly slow, and that's the point of it. Proust will dwell on a single moment, a sip of tea, a walk to the church, or reading in the garden, and he mines the full artistic beauty of that scene. He writes of the same aristocratic French countryside as Francois Mauriac, except Proust's characters are funny and poignant and raw. For me, this is the perfect way to end my intermission journey. It encourages me to see the artistry and beauty in mundane things, to richly savor each moment, to celebrate the life we have and the ways we are blessed, even in a pandemic. Plus, it's fun to be transported away from snowy Edmonton to a vacation villa in France.